Early in the 16th century, Africa began to suffer the greatest calamity in its history, the steady and continuous arrival of Europeans. This was one of 43 castles built by 7 European nations along the coast of West Africa. They stand today as monuments to rivalry and greed. For the Europeans had discovered the wealth of the Americas, mining wealth and plantation wealth, and the way to get it by using slave labor. Unwilling to take slaves from Europe and unable to find enough in the New World, they turned to Africa. Horrible in its brutality and violence, the slave trade robbed Africa of millions of men and women and even children. It spread cruelty and disaster. And yet, it was not only the enormous numbers that mattered. Every year for centuries, the trade removed from Africa tens of thousands of productive workers, of skilled workers, of men and women trained in tropical farming, in valuable crafts, and in many forms of enterprise. Today, the great Atlantic rollers have long lost their menace, and the forebears of these boys were among the lucky ones. But for millions before them, perhaps as many as 15 millions, this was the last they would ever see of their African homeland. Among the ship's captains, there were tight packers and loose packers. Their purpose was the same, to enlarge their profits by landing as many slaves as possible alive in the New World. Sometimes captured far inland, the victims of black traders were driven to the dungeons of their white partners on the coast. There were protests, but they dwindled as the profits of the trade became ever more corrupting to kings and merchants in Africa as well as in Europe. It became normal and even necessary for white people to think of their black victims as less than human. Racism grew out of slavery. At Cape Coast, a chapel was built for the British garrison right on top of the dungeons where at any one time up to 1,500 black captives awaited shipment. Not even the clergy spoke out against the trade, and some were ready to share in the pickings. Early in the 19th century, the Atlantic slave trade gradually began to come to an end. But even as the slavers withdrew, Europeans of a new kind began to penetrate deeply into the interior. These were the explorers. They had no warlike intentions. The guns they carried were for hunting and self-defense. It was seldom the fault of such men that the routes they opened up would all too soon be used by others with very different aims. Later generations of explorers would try for the North Pole or the South, or in our own day, the Moon. But for Mungo Park, Livingstone, Burton, and many others, Africa's legendary lakes and rivers were the great challenge. Above all else, they wanted to unlock the geographical mysteries of the continent. The strange thing about those remarkable men is that fact, they really were only interested, with a few exceptions, in finding things, in gold, in ivory, in geographical information, in land to take. Almost never were they really interested in the humanity of Africa. The great exception was David Livingstone. For the inhabitants of Central Africa, surely the best-loved European ever to set foot in their country. A missionary who became an explorer, Livingstone traced the great Zambezi River from its far inland source to the Indian Ocean, hoping that if he could only prove it to be a navigable waterway, the whole of Central Africa could be opened up to the blessings of the gospel. In 1855, he became the first white man to see the Victoria Falls, soon to be accepted as one of the natural wonders of the world. But less dramatic obstacles further downstream barred the way to navigation. His specially constructed river steamer had to turn back. Today, Livingstone's statue stands overlooking the falls to which he gave a name. The inscription says that Dr. David Livingstone discovered the falls. That was in 1855. What happened, in fact, was that African friends of his, with whom he was living some days upstream from here, told him about this amazing sight in their country and brought him to see it. And Livingstone, whose generosity of heart never allowed him to forget what he owed to Africans, was careful to record this in his memoirs. But the people who put the statue up long after evidently thought that nothing really exists until a white man has found it. But news of such earthly wonders failed to impress his missionary paymasters in London. To them, Livingstone's journeys and geographical researches were a sign that he was neglecting his work for God. They wanted converts, not waterfalls. He, for his part, found their attitude to the splendors of Africa so narrow that he was driven to resign his membership of the London Missionary Society. His duty, he believed, was to respond to a wider vision. There were plenty of others to do ordinary work. And so indeed there were. A growing band of dedicated men and women came forward from many nations to carry the gospel into these heathen lands. This is the Mangwe Pass, an historic place in the story of the white man's penetration of southern Africa. To the southwest lay the deserts of the Kalahari, and beyond to the southeast, white-ruled South Africa, while back behind me, through the hills, the old trail ran north to Bulawayo, capital of the kingdom of the Matabele. Here ran the southern frontier of that kingdom, and this pass was the only point of entry allowed by the Matabele king to European missionaries, traders, or hunters. In their attitude to the Africans whom they'd come to convert, most of the missionaries would have been happy to echo the words of Livingstone himself.
We come among them as members of a superior race and servants of a government that desires to elevate the more degraded portions of the human family. We are adherents of a benign, holy religion, and may by consistent conduct and wise, patient efforts become the harbingers of peace to a hitherto distracted and downtrodden race.
A few thought otherwise. Here are the words of Bishop Tozer of the University's mission.
What do we mean when we say that England or France are civilized countries, and the greater part of Africa is uncivilized? Surely the mere enjoyment of such things as railways and telegraphs do not necessarily prove their possessors to be in the first rank of civilized nations. Nothing can be so false as to suppose the outward circumstance of a people is the measure either of its barbarism or its civilization.
Nevertheless, most missionaries believed that they alone could raise Africans out of their spiritual degradation. They faced many perils, not from being boiled in Africa, which never happened, but from mortal fevers they could not cure. 6 out of 9 at Macalona Mission, which Livingstone had founded, died in a single year. Willing converts were few, so it had to be asked, is force justified to save a man's soul? Flogging was used at some mission stations, others disapproved.
If it is agreed that an expedition cannot be carried out unless the leader of it commits day-by-day acts of brute violence, the reply is that missionary expeditions had better not be undertaken. If missions can only be worked by methods which no supporter of the mission would dare to state in detail on a mission platform, then missions had better not be undertaken.
Another and unquestioned requirement lay at the core of missionary labors. If the gospel message was to be accepted, the spiritual beliefs which were the foundation of African community life had to be drained of their power and effectively destroyed. What the missionaries had come to do was to convince Africans that they must renounce their beliefs, forget their ancestors, and discard the very fabric of their culture. This missionary film, made as recently as the 1960s, makes the point very clearly.
As these women, whose lives have been spent in the dark shadow of fear, listen to the radiant young girls, they wonder at their joy and confidence. They remember the offerings they so often made to the juju themselves, the sacrifices which have been of no use. I will tell you of a God who does not require our sacrifice. He made sacrifice for us. And he shows to these fear-ridden people the symbol of God's love. Sometimes the people seek out the missionary later. We have lost our faith in these jujus, they say. We want to destroy them and begin a new life. Some rejoice. Some wonder what will become of them now. Finally comes the great day when they gather for the baptism service. Students from the training college, girls from the primary school, men and women, one by one they go down into the waters of baptism so that they might be renewed in Christ.
A skeptic might find it hard to see why one form of spiritual renewal should be so superior to another. But to these missionaries, this was the indispensable climax to their endeavors. This is a Methodist school called Wadilav in modern Zimbabwe. It's an important day because the Minister of Information, Mr. Nathan Shamurira, himself an old boy of the school, is making a visit. The event brings into focus some of the underlying currents and contradictions of recent history. Mr. Shamurira speaks for a government with radical ideas, which may well find itself at odds with religious conservatism. Yet he was educated here and brought up in the religion of white colonial settlers whose contempt for African humanity generally outweigh their Christian commitment to the brotherhood of man. It's one of the ironies of Christianity in Africa that, although it may have preceded colonial occupation, it can't now escape from the fact that it became deeply involved with the system. The foreign rulers may have departed, yet the tunes live on.
Unechimiro chake chisingatonwe nezvimwe zvinhu chisina mumwe.
Nowadays the sermon is no longer in English. This clergyman is speaking Shona, the language of most of the children at Wadilav. And he clearly feels no need to put so much emphasis on sin and guilt. How far is the accusation true that missionary teaching was really part of colonial teaching?
Well, the whole missionary enterprise here was an integral part of colonization. The missionaries came to this country with the colonizers from South Africa, and one particular missionary, Reverend Jackson, assisted in interpreting the deceptive Rad concession to King Lubengula at the time of colonization, and this relationship between the administrators, the soldiers and the miners, the gun and the Bible, so to speak, continued throughout the colonial period. But however, the missionary enterprise did also assist in the sharpening of contradictions within colonial society. On the one hand, the missionaries were preaching the equality of man, and yet they themselves were practicing discrimination in a deeply racially divided colonial society.
So they were part of the racist setup.
They were part of the racist setup. On the other hand, they were providing education in order to get literate workers to work in the factories and in mines and farms of the colonizer.
In honor of the minister's visit, the school has laid on a display of gymnastics. Most early missionaries tried to destroy the dancing arts and rhythms of Africa, saying that these were lascivious and evil. Yet African Christianity has managed to survive that effort at repression. And children at mission schools like this can have the fun of combining the new with the old. In another part of the school grounds, quite suddenly, old Africa was being revived. Here was a schoolgirl in the midst of a Christian mission, reenacting the role of a spirit medium as she goes into her trance. Helped by friends, she portrays an ancient ritual of Shona belief. This, many people still believe, is the method used by their ancestors to pass messages to the living. These girls were playing out a drama of their own history, one that many of them will have witnessed in their family backgrounds. Across the years of the colonial intrusion, it's a kind of psychological reconciliation between the present and the past. How does one summarize the effect of the missionary effort in terms of Africans coming to terms, coming to grips with the realities of the world?
Well, on the one hand, they were, anxious and did, take very drastic steps to destroy the culture of the African people. This was implicit in the teaching of Christianity itself. In the same context, it produced the contradictions which led to the downfall of colonialism by educating people, bringing them to an institution like this, where we were able to meet students from different parts of the country, and one was given a national perspective at an institution like this, and it was then possible when one left here to go and organize at a national level. So many of the national leaders of this country today were educated at mission schools. 9 out of every 10 educated blacks were educated at mission schools. Comrade Robert Mugabe, the first prime minister of an independent Zimbabwe, was brought up, trained and educated at Kutama, a Roman Catholic mission school. And many of the leaders in the present Zimbabwe government were educated at various mission schools throughout the country. So it did produce its own contradictions, and it sharpened the contradictions in colonial society.
Like a lot of other things in history, it had an unforeseen outcome.
Yes, yes, it did.
When you get an old boy coming to school, certainly some of you should feel inspired by the amount of contribution that he has made and what love has produced in him. So, sir, we are greatly honored that you have come. I know the visit has been a very brief one, but it is historical. And we do hope that when you have time, you'll be able to come back and see more of what love than you have seen today.
The minister receives a hero's send-off, partly for his role as one of the leaders who fought for Zimbabwe's independence, and partly, no doubt, for being the occasion of an extra day's holiday. Watching scenes like this, it would be hard to deny that the coming of Christianity to Central Africa has in the end brought many blessings. These children of Zimbabwe look forward to opportunities and freedoms unknown to their parents. Yet the cost has been a large one. Much of value in African culture was distorted or buried beneath the intolerant certainties of a foreign culture. And who can say whether, in the end, it won't be the practical benefits provided by the missions that outlast the spiritual ones? The little town of Bagamoyo had been the African starting point for missionaries as well as explorers. For David Livingstone, it was the journey's end. This is the place, ironically, a Catholic mission. The first Catholic mission on the East African mainland, where Susie and Chuma finally laid the body of their friend David Livingstone in its last resting place on the African continent. Throughout the final months of his life, Livingstone had always been accompanied by his two devoted companions, Susie and Chuma. They it was who nursed him through his last illness and undertook that great African journey of 1,500 miles to bring his body down to the coast after he died in 1873. For that most Christian act, they were frowned out of notice and curtly dismissed. Later, happily, those faithful companions received less churlish treatment. Yet it has to be said that Livingstone himself was not quite free of that same attitude. Remember his words: "We come among them as members of a superior race to elevate the more degraded portions of the human family." Of course, he was a man of his time, and such attitudes were common. But he also affirmed, and this was most uncommon, that black people could be made to be equal with white people by two gifts that Europe could offer: Christianity and commerce. That's what he believed, and he died believing it. But I have wondered, in my own years of wandering these trails, what Livingstone would have said if he could have seen the outcome of those two gifts. In the 1870s, the land around the little town of Kimberley, in what is now South Africa, was found to contain the richest deposits of diamonds in the world. Europeans in search of quick and easy profits rushed into the area. Among them was a young Englishman who'd come to South Africa at the age of 17. His name was Cecil Rhodes. In spite of his youth, Rhodes quickly learned that the path to great personal wealth led through great personal power. He set out to win that power by getting control of the diamond industry. He succeeded by clever maneuvering, the steady purchase of other men's claims when their funds were low, and the necessary ruthlessness. Rhodes saw to it that he was going to be the one to emerge as the king of diamonds. And his kingdom was going to be in Africa, where the English reigned supreme. This is what he wrote.
Just fancy those parts of the world that are at present inhabited by the most despicable specimens of human beings. What an alteration there would be if they were brought under Anglo-Saxon influence.
This early film, taken in Kimberley, shows that attitude of arrogance at work. Yet mineral wealth was not the only prize. There was territory to be won. All through the 19th century, British forces pushed out of Cape Colony, overcoming one African people after another, until in 1879 they came up against the most formidable of all, the Zulu. So far, this mission of the gun had gone well for the British. But the Zulu had 25,000 warriors ready to take up arms. Their king, Cetshwayo, wanted peace. After all, he'd been crowned with British approval. But the British wanted war. This genteel set of lecture slides, the Victorian equivalent of news film from the battlefront, reported the war as the public at home wished to imagine it. This was the heyday of empire, and here were British redcoats subduing one more mob of heathen savages before bestowing on them the blessings of Anglo-Saxon civilization. The reality was very different. At Isanchuana, Britain suffered one of the worst defeats in her imperial history, and the Zulus had a victory to celebrate. As the troops strove vainly to get the lids off their ammunition boxes, the Zulu MPs overwhelmed them. At the end of the day, 800 British soldiers lay dead. Not a single wounded man was spared. But at Rorke's Drift, a few miles away, a tiny British garrison with great bravery withstood 3 Zulu regiments numbering nearly 5,000 men. Modern firepower took its devastating toll. Determined to break Zulu power once and for all, another British invasion force, equipped with field artillery and the new rapid-firing Gatling guns, advanced on the king's capital at Ulundi. Here they found the Zulu army, but what followed was a massacre rather than a battle. Some 1,500 Zulu warriors died in fruitless charges on the guns. British casualties were put at 12. It was the end of the independent Zulu nation. A billionaire by this time, Rhodes now unfolded his plan for British rule from Cairo to Cape Town. His immediate ambition was fixed on the upland country to the north of the Limpopo River. Here in this broad plateau, with its pleasant climate, there was abundant land for cattle, and beneath it the promise of still more mineral wealth, especially gold. He faced one great obstacle. 60 years earlier, a branch of the Zulu known as the Matabele had broken away, trekked north, and built a strong military kingdom in the land that Rhodes now meant to seize for white settlement. The African bush has long since moved in and taken over. But this deserted spot, 100 years ago, was the living heart of Matabele power and the seat of government of its king. King Lobengula was only the second ruler of the Matabele. He was destined to be the last. True to their Zulu tradition, his men lived by the spear, raiding their neighbors, the Shona people, for cattle and women. This, they believed, was their land by right and title. But now, in a series of deceptions, Rhodes and his cronies proceeded to dispossess the Matabele of their land, their cattle, and their independence. One day, King Lobengula told a story to a white visitor to his court. He said to him, "Have you ever watched a chameleon and a fly? The chameleon gets behind the fly and gently puts one foot forward, then another. And when he's close enough, he darts his tongue, and the fly disappears. I am that fly," said Lobengula, "and you are the chameleon." On the outskirts of his royal kraal, Lobengula had allowed a few white missionaries to establish themselves. This is all that remains of a settlement run by Jesuits, whose celibate way of life had no appeal to the Matabele. But other missionaries, Protestants of various denominations, because, of course, the many schisms of the Christian faith were also imported with the missionaries, did begin to acquire some influence, but not without misunderstandings, as this old man, now well over 100, remembers.
Katina mateti china manda cheti sibara maziso tasingazive kuti ane vaiuya chete kuuya zvavo singazive kuti vanobva kupi achibva kumba kwake uko.
Not far from the capital, across a small river, was the Anglican mission of Hope Fountain. The early missionaries were caught, almost at once, in an unavoidable dilemma. To whom was their first loyalty? To the Africans, who trusted them and whose guests they were, or to their own kith and kin? The Reverend Charles Helm, who lived in this place, made in the end a crucial choice. He was Lobengula's trusted white friend, but secretly at the same time, he began to work for Rhodes. The fact was that these missionaries soon became convinced, and no doubt rightly, and as their records show, that if they were going to convert a sizable number of Matabele, the king's power must be destroyed and Matabele culture and independence undermined. And Rhodes, they saw, was the man to do both. Step by step, Lobengula's power was eroded. He appealed to Queen Victoria. He was advised to sign treaties. Some of those who advised him to sign the treaties had come in peace and trust, but they still deceived him. The Reverend Helm lies buried here. On his tomb, his fellow missionaries felt able to inscribe the words, "Friend of the Matabele." Was he their friend? Or from within the certainties of his own belief, did he connive in their betrayal? By 1890, Rhodes and his men were ready to move. These are scenes from the feature film Roads of Africa, about the famous pioneer column. They show it in terms of the glorious legend it was to become for the white settlers who followed. Almost a justification in itself for their right to the land they were about to seize. Lobengula had 16,000 warriors eager to attack, but fearing defeat, he held them back. The column headed north, avoiding direct contact with the Matabele and passing unopposed through the country of the less warlike Shona. Each man had been promised 15 gold prospecting claims and a 3,000-acre farm. A contemporary described them like this.
Such a mixed lot I never saw in my life. All sorts and conditions, from the aristocrat down to the street Arab. Tears and waifs of humanity mingling together like a hodgepodge.
Some of the pioneers came, in fact, from the leading families of Cape Colony. If the expedition met with defeat, Rhodes knew that their influential fathers would press the British government for military assistance. An unknown photographer captured the moment when the Union Jack was raised over Fort Salisbury, fulfilling Rhodes's dream that this earth shall be English. The moment became part of the myth. Established here for no particular reason of geography, Fort Salisbury duly became the modern city of Salisbury, now renamed Harare. Elsewhere on the continent, towns can be unmistakably African in their flavor and their style of life, but not this one. In just on 60 years, they turned it into the very model of a white man's city. And just over there is the flagstaff that commemorates the place where all that began. amazingly enough, it's still here. For this is what it says: to the Pioneer Corps, specially recruited to become the first civil population of Mashonaland. But who were more civil? The black people who had long dwelt in Mashonaland and made it fruitful, or the white people who came here and took it from them by deceit and violence? Maybe that sounds a harsh question now, and yet the dispossession of the Shona was also harsh. They had settled the land centuries earlier, mastered and tamed it, and now with this they had altogether lost their birthright. Among those who had travelled up with the pioneers was Rhodes's close friend and instrument, Dr. Starr Jameson. Rhodes now chose him to administer this newly won territory. To the southwest, there still remained the undefeated Matabele. In 1892, Jameson decided the time had come to finish with them. A pretext was easily found. Although the Shona people were now supposed to be under white protection, they were still the target of sporadic raids. A dispute over cattle quickly produced the war that Jameson needed. In traditional style, the Matabele regiments prepared to fight for their capital, Bulawayo, against Jameson's advancing troops. No amount of Matabele courage could matter now. As an English poet wrote in bitter satire, "Whatever happens, we have got the Maxim gun, and they have not." After defeat came dispossession. Nearly all of Matabele farming land and most of the 250,000 Matabele cattle were confiscated by Rhodes's British South Africa Company or by individual settlers. The structure of Matabele life was shattered. The London Missionary Society wrote to congratulate Rhodes. As missionaries, we have little to bind our sympathies to the Matabele, neither can we pity the downfall of their power. Lobengula is said to have told his followers that rather than have a single bone of his body touched by a white man, he would disappear like a needle in the grass. And disappear he did, while some of his warriors tried vainly to find a new homeland northward across the Zambezi.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome on board our cruise, Amanzi Atungayo, Cinderella word meaning the water that rises. My name is Phoebe, and Captain Sylvester is in command this evening. All drinks served on board are included in the toll price.
Before long, white settlers too began to push northward, over this great waterway where a generation earlier, David Livingstone had wandered alone. To Rhodes would fall the unique distinction of having not one, but two African colonies bearing his name.
The stretch of water we are now on is the deepest and the narrowest part of the Zambezi, and it was here where the pioneers chose to cross as from 1889. They floated their wagons, used the light balsa note, and swam their kerker. Being so close to the river, a frighteningly large amount of the settlers became ill and often died from malaria and blackwater fever.
Livingstone had died exactly 20 years earlier, and now the way was open for Christianity and commerce. Here, in these lands where Livingstone had found, as he said, perfect security for life and property. But where, for Africans, there was no longer any such thing. But African resistance was not yet over. In 1896, just 3 years later, surviving Matabele regiments of about 14,000 men, some now armed with rifles, rose in furious revolt. They swept down on isolated white settlements and slaughtered more than 100 farmers. Caught unprepared, the bulk of the settlers made a defensive laager at their new capital of Bulawayo. Then the Shona people, infuriated by taxation and forced labor on white farms, rose in their turn. Led by the priests of their religion, the spirit mediums Nahanda and Kagubi, they fought a stubborn guerrilla war for many months. It was not until 1897 that both risings were finally overcome.
Navarungu, Sigwagwagwa, Nenganunu, Zakaonera wakazionera kuvarungu zauya navarungu ndozvaibisa navarungu vanhu vanga vasina vanga nepfuti chete nemapfumo.
The settler forces had suffered considerable losses in the fighting. Their mood was not merciful. So-called rebels were hunted down and, when taken prisoner, treated as dangerous criminals. Chained together, they were brought before summary courts and not infrequently hanged from the nearest tree. Captured at last, Nahanda and Kagubi were also hanged. Such were the foundations on which Cecil Rhodes built his empire. Having thrust aside anyone who stood in his way, Rhodes spent little time in the country he had formed. This was the hut he used as an office. Close by, the colonial government's state house was built directly on the site of King Lobengula's old headquarters. At his death in Cape Town in 1902, Rhodes's body lay in state and was then taken to Bulawayo, where it was carried in procession through the streets. In the Matopo Hills, south of the city, Rhodes had a summer house built, where he liked to sit in the evening and watch the sun go down over that old Africa into whose history he had broken with such explosive force. Here the coffin was placed overnight before being carried up into the hills for burial. Thousands of Europeans had gathered at the spot called World's View. Rhodes had come here in the past and had chosen it as his final resting place. So here he lies, in the heart of the country that he conquered. But are we to see this grave as the final act of taking possession, or the ultimate insult to the people he dispossessed? Rhodes has evoked conflicting judgments. For the world of wealth, he was and is the mighty empire builder, the benevolent millionaire, the hero of money. For the world of poverty, he remains a plunderer and a pirate, the robber baron who took with both hands what did not belong to him. Rhodes and his men brought material progress, and 19th century Africa certainly needed progress. But they brought it in such a way that Africans could not share in it. They deprived Africans of that very condition, freedom, that enables mankind to move forward and develop. So the great mission of the Bible and the gun ended by completely contradicting itself, by producing an African servitude in which the visions and the dreams of men such as Livingstone were bound to be denied and set at naught. The west coast of Africa, looking today much as it did 100 years ago. At that time, the old evils of the slave trade had become a distant, though disgraceful, memory. But there now opened a new chapter of confrontation along these tropical shores. In past years, Europeans had come here for profitable business. Now they wanted more, much more. Old trading posts like this one had long been the scene of a partnership between maritime traders from Europe and local Africans. By the 1880s, that old partnership was being swept away in a dramatic change, the outcome of a new European drive for overseas empire. Industrialized countries led by France and Britain had begun to invade the black continent, each hoping for new sources of raw materials for its factories, new markets for its manufacturers, and new positions of advantage against its rivals. This was called the scramble for Africa. By 1914, only two countries remained outside European possession, Liberia in the west and Ethiopia in the east. Britain had seized the lion's share of control. Egypt and the Sudan in the north, the immense wealth of South Africa, valuable colonies like Rhodesia and Kenya, and richly populated territories such as Nigeria and the Gold Coast. France had invaded Algeria in the 1830s. Now, after new wars of conquest, she added more colonies to her empire south of the Sahara, including the island of Madagascar. Little Portugal carved out two vast colonies, Angola and Mozambique, while Imperial Germany took the Cameroons and southwest Africa, and on the east coast, Tanganyika. The vast Congo basin fell to King Leopold of the Belgians. Italy and Spain completed the enclosure. The fate of the continent was utterly changed. Between the colonizing powers themselves, the carve-up was peaceful, but their rivalry was intense. In 1884, a Congress of the competing governments met in Berlin to settle their disputes. Germany's Iron Chancellor Bismarck was there. And active behind the scenes was the ambitious Belgian king. He spoke for them all when he said, "I am determined to get my share of this magnificent African cake." Any power that could occupy African soil could effectively claim it. Now the task was to stake out frontiers in utterly uncharted land. Said the French Prime Minister, "We have embarked on a gigantic steeplechase into the unknown." The British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, was to say of this period, "We've been engaged in drawing lines on maps where no man's foot has ever trod. We've been giving away mountains and rivers and lakes to each other, only hindered by the small impediment that we never knew exactly where we were." The great game was to get hold of places and positions of advantage over rivals, no matter what irrational frontiers might result. One of the most absurd cases was the magnificent Gambia River. Britain had long held Bathurst, Banjul today, and was determined to keep this river route to the interior. But France, invading from the west coast, enclosed all the territory surrounding the Gambia River in her new colony of Senegal. So the French were naturally eager to obtain the Gambia River. They offered Britain, in exchange, the much larger and richer Ivory Coast. But the British Parliament insisted on keeping the Gambia, thus dividing the peoples of the region. And the result was, and is, a country that is 300 miles long, but never more than 30 miles wide. What the African inhabitants might think of this colonial carve-up was never asked. The European idea, in the words of one British governor, was to seize African territory and then, as much as possible, rule the country as if there were no inhabitants. In fact, European contempt for Africans now reached new depths, and no wonder. For how otherwise than by asserting that Africans were helpless children, lazy savages, could Christian Europe justify taking their countries away from them? The helpless children, meanwhile, sang their own version of a famous hymn. Onward, Christian soldiers, into heathen lands, prayer books in your pockets, rifles in your hands. Take the happy tidings where trade can be done. Spread the peaceful gospel with the Gatling gun. The European invasions were widely resisted. Conquest was never easy. And sometimes, as these old drawings and photographs testify, conquest led to a ruthless killing that later generations would prefer to forget. Resistance took many shapes. In French West Africa, a focal point was found in Muslim loyalties. Many heroes, still unforgotten, came on that scene. Some, like the Senegalese religious leader Ahmadou Bamba, offered the way of peace, but were still sent into exile. Others, like the fierce warrior leader Samori, fought off French attack after attack and was crushed and exiled only after years of war. Death took many, strong or weak. With the skulls of earlier wars displayed in their capital, Kumasi, the powerful Ashanti nation ruled over most of modern Ghana. Led by their kings, who had the title of Asantehene, they'd long defended their country against Britain, but now they desperately wanted a peaceful settlement. In 1895, fearing a disastrous war with Britain, King Prempeh made a strong bid for peace from his palace here at Kumasi. He offered the British the right to establish in Ashanti a chartered company with all the concessions, the privilege that such a company could possibly desire. But it wasn't enough, for the British now wanted territorial possession as well as privilege. The Ashanti nation had already fought long, hard battles against the British. But this time, in 1896, they decided to surrender. In a ceremony of deliberate humiliation, the king was made to kiss the British commander's boot and then sent into exile. But it wasn't the end of the story. The British now blundered. A new British governor, Sir Frederick Hodgson, decided that he had to get possession of the sacred golden stool, symbol of the Ashanti nation's soul. Arriving at the British fort here in Kumasi, he ordered the assembled chiefs to hand the stool over. Worse still, he demanded the right to sit on it, something that no person had ever been allowed to do, not even the king himself. To Hodgson's final insult, the Ashanti replied with war. This little fort at Kumasi is what the British had built, just in case, and now they sorely needed it. The few dozen British inmates of the fort were besieged for months and had to eat rats to stay alive. Hodgson's act of folly had exacted a bitter price. Efforts to send in relief from the coast were repeatedly frustrated by Ashanti resistance, until finally the governor and his wife got away to the coast and the absurd but tragic affair could be closed. This ended war between Britain and Ashanti, and a year later, in 1901, the British quietly annexed the country, which became part of the colony of the Gold Coast. All over Africa, the new military technology of automatic guns gave easy victories to the invaders. Countless resistors died, many thousands at the single battle of Omdurman in Britain's conquest of the Sudan. Meanwhile, in another part of the Sudan, the French were also scoring victories. For the most part, public opinion rejoiced. For were these not victories over an inferior species, a kind of joke humanity? There were some critics, but not many, and their voice was ignored or silenced. What really mattered was to do down one's European rivals. If you were British, to get the better of the French in West Africa or of the Germans in East Africa, while orphans like little Uganda were left on the protective doorstep of Father John Bull. Even before 1900, there came a new source of conflict: settlers from Europe, French in the far north, Dutch and then British in the far south, and some Germans. Other settlers were attracted to the good farming land of the east, to Tanganyika, northern and southern Rhodesia, and the British territories of Uganda and Kenya. Once again, nobody asked permission. An early French governor had laid down the golden rule. Wherever good water and fertile land are found, he said, settlers must be installed without questioning whose land it may be. The settlers, not surprisingly, agreed. The next step in East Africa was to build a railway from the coast to the interior. The line was completed in 1901, and millions of acres of good farming land in Kenya were opened to white ownership and settlement for the buying price of next to nothing. These white strangers, oddly enough, were at first welcomed by the African inhabitants. But the welcome didn't last for long, for they soon discovered that colonial government wanted them to give things, above all their land and their labor. These colonial demands provoked a repeated resistance, and against that resistance, the colonial government, with white settlers arriving in ever larger numbers from Britain, waged a war with little mercy, and of course, with rifles and machine guns against spears and arrows.
Macinire nĩ ũndũ wa kũmena andũ ũndũ gũtikĩrĩ ũndũ mekagwo nĩ kũmakia andũ ũguo magagĩũka magagĩtorekia na andũ morarĩ magacina mĩciĩ.
This beating down of a sometimes violent and desperate African protest was called pacification, or less politely, hammering. A British officer then fighting in Kenya kept a sadly instructive diary.
Marched into Fort Hall, and the expedition comes to an end. To my mind, the people of the Embu have not been sufficiently hammered, and I should like to go back at once and have another go at them. During the first phase of our expedition against the Irieni, we killed 797 niggers, and during the second phase against the Embu, we killed about 250.
There was, in fact, much more of the same thing. In a sixth campaign against the Kenya Nandi, for example, British troops reported killing 1,117 people, besides seizing all their livestock. In 1906, a junior British minister in London cabled this protest. Surely it cannot be necessary to go on killing these defenseless people on such an enormous scale. The minister's name was Winston Churchill, but on that occasion his intervention had no effect. By 1915, about 4 million acres of African farming land in central Kenya had been given to about 1,000 British settlers. By the 1920s, about half of the able-bodied men of Kenya's two largest farming peoples, the Kikuyu and Luo, were working as laborers for British newcomers. How was that done? The answer, once again, was something new in Kenya: taxation. To cultivate these splendid acres, it was necessary to make Africans pay taxes in cash. Having no money economy of their own, Africans could pay tax in cash only if they went to work for a European wage. An old Maasai recalls those early days.
Sasa wazungu walipokaa sasa walianza kutawala. Walipotawala, kitu walitaka kodi. Masai zamani hapana lipa kodi ya kichwa kama ile tunaita zamani potax, tulikuwa nalipa na nyumba, walikuwa naita kodi ya nyumba.
The Maasai proved particularly good at dodging the payment of the new taxes. So the colonial government thought it should send some of these apparently idle warriors to school, so as to turn them, if possible, into tax collectors among their own people. Small boys were seized for this purpose.
Sasa serikali walitoa askari yake kuja kuchukua watoto. Sasa mimi ni moja ya wale watoto ambayo walishikwa kupelekwa skuli. Sasa nilishikwa nikapelekwa skuli. Sasa pamoja na wale watoto wengine.
On the other side of the continent, in northern Nigeria, the colonial scene was very different. With no white settlers, life was peaceful. Things continued much as before. The British had conquered this huge region, far from the sea, for no real reason other than to keep it from the French. So the British were content with a supervision which allowed them to take a back seat. Under the direction of Lord Lugard, this was called indirect rule. This was the residence of the British official who governed the northern Nigerian province of Kano. Indirect rule meant ruling through local kings, in this case the local emir, who after defeat accepted British overlordship. On condition that nothing was done to modernize or democratize the conquered system, indirect rule was cheap and highly effective. Local kings and princes kept the peace and law and order in their own interest, as well as in that of the British. Both sides, at the top, had much to gain. So kings, like this one, the Emir of Katsina, were able to stay in power and even add to their personal privileges. They were able to call on their own local retainers to govern the everyday affairs of the country. In this way, the native governing class, as the doctrine said, was to remain a real living force, as well as being a curious and interesting pageantry.
The ceremonies are the same as 1,000 years ago. There were kings in northern Nigeria when Richard Lionheart set out on crusade. Today, he and all the emirs of northern Nigeria play their part as subjects of the King of England. But their subjects still show their loyalty as in the days when Katsina was warring with her neighbors. Katsina still keeps her way of life, still resists new influences from the world outside.
In short, no modernization of any kind, and therefore big problems for the future. I talked to Nigerian Professor Obaro Ikeme.
For the larger part of Nigeria, British rule did not mean anything for many years. In other words, although at the centers of administration, there was a change which could be seen by the people and felt by the people. In the outlying areas, life went on as if the British did not exist. If you take Lugard's own particular area, the north, for example, the seat of the emir and the seats of the district heads may have felt the immediate impact of the British presence. But the villages were ordered and run just as before, with one important difference though, taxation, that the people had to pay tax to a new power. The British built up a corps of Africans who became known as native administrators, developed some commitment to the system. The salaries were comfortable, they had power, which they used to enrich themselves at the expense of their followers and their subjects. Consequently, the British were able to succeed largely by developing a core of people who became partners with them.
British officers, headed by a resident, are there in every emirate to advise and assist the emir and his ministers in their day-to-day work. And each month, the resident presides at a full meeting with the emir's council. There may be word from Nigeria's governor in Lagos, or from the colonial office in London, or the council may discuss the repatriation of pilgrims from Mecca. The dignity of the past, the traditions of Katsina are present in the council chamber.
Here, once more, this time behind polite words, was the essence of colonial paternalism. In the French colonies along the coast, the scene was both the same and different. Dakar, capital of Senegal, actually the little suburb of Rufisque, a charmingly nostalgic place. Senegal was France's oldest colony in tropical Africa, and one where the French presence, like that of the British in Nigeria, could easily be absorbed. Generally, the French ran their colonies on much the same system as the British, but there was one important difference. The British thought that their Africans could never become anything but Africans, and certainly not British. The French idea, on the contrary, was that in the end, at some distant time, all their Africans would become black Frenchmen. The culture and the language of France were offered as the eventual supreme blessings. This idea was called assimilation. Originally, this was a generous idea, but colonial rule reduced it to little or nothing. Yet in 4 municipalities of coastal Senegal, assimilation did take effect. This picturesque island of Gorée, just off the port of Dakar, was one. Here you could go to school and even become a French citizen. But you belonged to a tiny minority. By 1926, only 48,000 Senegalese had become assimilated out of a total of 1.5 million. The Senegalese historian, Professor Cheikh Anta Diop, explains.
C'est en fait certain, dans la pratique, ce n'était pas possible. Et dans la pratique, il y a eu 4 communes, ici au Sénégal et partout ailleurs, pratiquement, c'était le système de l'indigénat. Donc, à cause du rapport numérique, la politique d'assimilation n'était pas applicable sur le terrain.
One man from Gorée Island who did make it and carved out for himself a brilliant career was Blaise Diagne. Of humble origins, but Diagne became the first black man to be elected to the French National Parliament in Paris. He campaigned for black rights and began to win concessions. That was in 1914. During the First World War, an embattled France called for tens of thousands of African troops as Flanders swallowed its victims. Blaise Diagne agreed to be France's recruiting sergeant, and his African reputation vanished in the slaughter.
Guerre. Ku la force wu doon dem ci guerre. Ku la force wu doon dem ci guerre. Dañu ma forcé jële ma ci suma loxin dee ak suma papa yóbbu ma xaw ma ci sañ-sañ bañ ma tax ma dem xam nga ku la bëgg a yóbbu ci guerre du la neex gannaaw xamuloo ko du la neex.
France had long relied on African mercenaries, even as far back as the Crimean War. But now it was different in scale and in suffering. More than 200,000 African troops, mostly conscripts, were sent to France. And at least 170,000 were thrown into the Holocaust of the trenches. Thousands never came home. Others returned with an experience that survivors have still not forgotten.
xeex nañu ak Allemagne yi rey nañu leen ñi la ñuy jóg seen baat ñu jóg suñu baat ñi la ñuy jóg seen loxo ñu jóg seen loxo ñi lañ jël di ñëw nekk gumba ñi lañ jël di ñëw nekkul dara nekkuñu dara waaw loxo bi ci la bokk ci dog benn bala ngi dugg génn si fii mu ngi ne benn bal mu ngi nii bëgg meer mu ngi nii bëgg dal fi génn si fii mu ngi.
Shoulder to shoulder, white men and black men, equal in the trenches. Were they now to become equal in the colonies? Only the monuments suggested that. With the coming of peace in 1918, the victorious colonial systems looked more strongly entrenched than ever before, though military rule now gave way to civilian government. This led to a far more thorough system of tax collection to pay for the government. The linchpin of the British system was the district officer.
That's where I come in. I'm the district officer in this particular area. The native authority treasurer sends his figures to me for checking against last year's figures. When it's decided what the tax is to be this year, I go off to tell the chiefs and people what they're to pay and why. That's my wife. I spend so much time doing the rounds that if she didn't come, we wouldn't see much of each other. We take our beds and everything else, as the rest houses where we spend the nights have no furniture. You know, we're very ordinary people, but the pagans still find us a bit of a puzzle without us and father. That's the local chief. We ask news of the crops and the children. It's like sitting in a shop window. We come here every year and follow the same ritual, but they always behave as though it was the first time. Peace is all very well, but it is dull, and they love a bit of variety.
Many colonial officials were good, practical, hard-working people devoted to their ideals. They were sure that the strong paternal arm of colonial rule must be a blessing for Africans and would have to be continued for centuries. They firmly believed that if left to themselves, Africans would simply go on living as before, and that, they thought, would be a thoroughly bad thing. An old film tells the story as the colonial officials saw it.
This simple life under the hot African sky was once a life of fear and uncertainty.
British rule has brought peace. The enterprise of European officials and settlers and of Indian traders has opened up the country. But there is still a long battle to be fought with ignorance, poverty, and disease.
In these lands, where there are so many changes to be made, much can be achieved by money and the initiative of the white man.
In the more favoured colonies, those were the hopes of the 1920s, and in some respects they were fulfilled. There came the founding of the first modern hospitals, veterinary services, and other benefits of Western life. But all the money to pay for these good things had to come from Africans. So there now began a drive for the export of crops to yield cash. The cash crop era got into its stride. Groundnuts, as here in Senegal, were a crop that brought cash to farmers and to colonial purchasing companies. But cash crop success also brought problems.
Il est certain que l'arachide a été introduite pour alimenter tout simplement la culture. La monoculture de l'arachide a été introduite pour des raisons industrielles, ni plus ni moins. C'est en 1848, je crois, que des Marseillais l'ont introduite ici pour fabriquer tout simplement de l'huile pour vendre ça sur le marché international. Et on a spécialisé finalement, la tendance est née de spécialiser chaque colonie en fonction de ce qu'elle pouvait produire le mieux. Et on a donc toutes les zones sahéliennes ont été spécialisées pour la culture de l'arachide, des zones comme la Guinée pour la culture de la banane et le riz, et ainsi de suite. Mais ça, c'était en fonction, non pas des intérêts locaux des indigènes, de ceux qui habitent ces terres-là, mais en fonction des besoins en matières premières des usines qui tournaient à Marseille, à Bordeaux et en Europe d'une façon générale.
So long as their crops were bought, African growers could be reasonably content. But in 1929, there began the huge and long disaster of the World Depression, and prices collapsed. Food production for local people, already badly hit because of land taken for cash crops, became a subject of major crisis. What was true of the French Empire was just as true of all the others. Here in the Gold Coast, the big cash crop was cocoa, providing the bulk of the colony's exports. The crop was grown and harvested entirely by African farmers, who had to sell it to British and other foreign buying companies. These companies banded together so as to pay the farmers an artificially low price. The farmers of Ghana, then the Gold Coast, nonetheless worked so well that they became the world's biggest producers of cocoa, and so of chocolate, which Africans didn't eat. But the gains were far from equally shared. The Ghanaian historian, Professor Ada Boahi.
There's no doubt at all that the farmers were being cheated. The prices that were being paid for the cocoa bore no relationship to the prices that they had to pay for the imported goods. We had no say in the pricing of our own commodities. We had no say in what we paid for what was imported. This was, in fact, one of the greatest indictments against the colonial economic policies. The fact that so much emphasis was placed on a single cash crop. And we had to import rice, we had to import oil, palm oil, and so on, to feed ourselves, because so much emphasis and so much attention was paid to this single cash crop cocoa. The colonial governments were just concerned with obtaining raw materials to feed their factories abroad.
The raw materials were produced by the skill and enterprise of hard-working African men and women. Yet the advertisements in Europe, deeply racist by this time, presented an insultingly different picture. At the same time, African businessmen found that the trading positions they had established in earlier times were now swept away.
There's no doubt at all that before the colonial period, Africans were playing a far more important and dominant role in the economy than during the colonial period. There were many of them running their own import-export businesses. In the 1920s and 1930s, all these African merchant princes virtually disappeared from the field because the dice was so much loaded against them as a result of the colonial system. The banks were discriminating against them in the granting of loans. The expatriate firms, and particularly the Syrian Lebanese firms, were undercutting them, and they just could not stand the challenge. And therefore, many of them simply ran out of business. And the children of these great merchant princes now became the employees of the great African capitalist companies like UAC, UGC, SUA, and so on.
Colonial trading companies, British, French, Belgian, Portuguese, monopolized wholesale business with the full backing of their colonial governments. What King Leopold had called this magnificent African cake was beginning to yield its riches. Often those were painful days, but they have to be recalled by anyone who wishes to understand the problems of Africa now. The turmoil of today in the Congo, or Zaire, has its roots in the infamous Congo Free State of King Leopold. Here, the emphasis was on the growing of rubber, and the methods used to extract it were no better than a reign of terror. Local people were forced to collect rubber under the most cruel conditions, as these old photographs show. If the rubber they collected was poor or small in quantity, men, and sometimes women too, could expect to lose a hand or foot in punishment. Terrible things were done. An official British fact-finding commission reported. The daily agony of an entire people unrolled itself in all its repulsive, terrifying details. Public opinion in Europe grew horrified. Gradually, the agonies were reduced. Yet huge damage had been done, moral as well as physical, and was going to cast a dark and violent shadow over the future of the Congo. Forced labor by the 1920s was practiced on a wide scale in most of the colonies. All early roads and railways were built by forced labor. Much was achieved, but the cost in life and health was sometimes catastrophic. This spectacular railway in French Equatorial Africa was built by 125,000 Africans to link the coast with Brazzaville, the inland capital. Beyond doubt, a great feat of engineering. But before a single passenger could travel on it, nearly 14 10,000 Africans were to die in building it. Travel in comfort came at a price. By the 1920s, the colonial railway map was complete. These lines had one central purpose: to ensure the export of minerals and other wealth, most of all from southern Africa. European mining activity for gold, copper, zinc, diamonds transformed southern Africa, thanks again to African labor acquired by the usual procedure of administrative force and taxation. Conditions were hard to bear. Some 30,000 Africans died in southern Rhodesian mines between 1904 and 1933, mostly of disease. And wages at the end of that period were lower than they'd been at the start. This labor system was called Chibaro. Very old men can still remember it.
Oh, apa na munhu wanga chiramba vanga vachienda zvavo kuchibharo kuti vabata chibharo vaitaulirwa ishe vobvisa vanhu voenda kuchibharo kubasa.
Gold mining boomed. In those years of Chibaro, the southern Rhodesian mining industry produced gold worth 87 million pounds sterling, at the cost of 20 dead African miners each week on average for 30 years. Just as in the bigger mines of South Africa, conditions for miners were appalling. Safety provisions were primitive. Discipline was often brutal. Healthcare almost non-existent. Prison labor was used whenever available, and that was often. And child labor too.
Takamboenda achiri vakomana so aenda kuchibharo kwanzi kunodikanwa vanhu kubasa.
After 1930, the whole labor system in large regions had come to depend on people having to abandon their villages and go far away to work in colonial mines or on plantations. This was called migrant labor, a huge upheaval which soon began to destroy the old stabilities of rural Africa. An official British committee in 1935 reported that the old order of society was being completely undermined by migrant labor. The years ahead were going to confirm it. But it was in the Portuguese colonies, especially Angola and Mozambique, that forced labor was at its worst. Here in Mozambique, and by brutal methods, African farmers were forced to grow cotton and to sell it at prices fixed by the colonial government. Prices kept so low that the farmers used to say of the cotton that they were forced to grow, that cotton was the mother of poverty. The raw cotton was sent to textile factories in Portugal and returned in the form of shirts for Africans to buy. All the profits for Portuguese. The more the farmers learned to hate cotton, the more they were forced to grow it on pain of severe punishment.
Senzaku lisinzisa tiko hinkwaro akuvari byala thonji atiko hila lingasungula kushaniseka hakona avakapataji avafamba amintini nemasin'wini loko bile dina vakhumuka avalandziwa vayatekiwa vabiwa etintshilani vaya masin'wini na vakadlanga
Come. Sinaje. Akona huwa anashitapelwa kwa data kama na wale mkatoni. Na haiko basi ni yala. Sinikangatelwa ni bash pakani shaunari kusarengana. Siba jele. 15 days jele.
The farmers in this old film had no legal means of protest, but they could express their anger by singing anti-colonial songs in their own language. There seemed then no way out, no hope ahead.